Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Molly Hudash
and Azaii Muniz. Alrighty, you guys. I am super excited to be here. Azaii, it's our very first content-related episode. Yes. So excited to be here, and especially for tonight's episode, because tonight we're not just talking content, we're talking about my favorite thing, which is connections between content areas, and especially with the content you're learning now for the MCAT and the content you will be learning later on when you guys are all at HMS, just like Azaii.
Yes, absolutely. We're really excited to just make those connections. We don't really get to do that very often. And this time of year, Molly, I think we recognize that students are in very different places, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes, around this time of year, some students are getting ready to test. And I don't know about you, but when I was getting ready to test, I almost needed like brain chill moments, where I could just take in information and not freak out about the information that I was taking in.
Mm-hmm. You get a little sense of wonder. That's my favorite thing. It's not necessarily like you're in learning cram mode, like, oh God, every word that comes out of this person's mouth, I just have to shove it in my brain. It's like something to ponder and make you think and make you appreciate the things that you already know, that kind of put things in perspective. That is what I think is so necessary at this point. You're totally right. Gives you a little bit of rest, but also a little bit of intrigue almost to get you inspired to continue studying, or inspired to get ready for your test if you're at that stage in your prep as well.
Yeah, I think also even if students are starting their apps, like their med school application, it can just be nice to get that reconnection. And today's topic, I think, does a really great job of bridging MCAT information and what students will learn. And that's the immune system, a topic that not everybody likes, but I think can be really fun. I was recently on an infectious disease rotation, and it was so much fun. It was really mentally stimulating, and so the immune system has a special place in my heart.
Well, which is your favorite branch of the immune system, Azaii, now that you've done your infectious disease rotation?
I think the myeloid lineage is really cool, and so that's not the B cells, not the T cells, but the other cell types that are a part of the immune system. I think the B cells and T cells have their place, and we're totally going to talk about those. If you're kind of wondering, wait, which one does what? But I think the bacterial infections I find really interesting.
Oh my goodness. I'm so excited to pick your brain, Azaii. This is going to be fun, you guys. Buckle up. We're going to hear from Azaii, the infectious disease expert today. This is going to be amazing. So what I want to do here, before we hop into all of these amazing cell types, all of these amazing functions that your body goes through daily to protect you from invaders, right? I kind of want to set the stage, right? With some content that's really important to know for the MCAT, but also content that's going to frame our discussion throughout this podcast here today, right? So the first thing that I want to clarify or cover, right, is the first big division of your immune system, right? Because you know that you've got a lot of different layers to immunity, right? There are lots of pathogens coating, I don't want to scare people, coating the outside of your skin constantly. There are bacteria all around you, pathogens everywhere, right? And yet you're not constantly sick. You don't always have a fever. You're not actively fighting infections every minute of every day, right? You're not flooded with antibodies, all these traditionally discussed hallmarks of infection. And that's because of the very first level of your immune system, right? The innate immune system, right? And the innate immune system is incredibly crucial, right? It doesn't get, I think, the love and the attention that it deserves because it's not highly specific, right? It's not it's not got all of these amazing things like memory, specificity, antibody response, right? It's not as flashy as the adaptive immune system, the other branch of the immune system that so many people are so fascinated by. But personally, I love the adaptive immune system, right? That includes, even physical barriers, things like your skin, your sweat, your tears, right? Stomach acid, right? The things that are always there. They're not necessarily even cell types, but they are preventing you from getting infections constantly. They never stop. That's one of my favorite things about the immune system, right? The innate immune system, it never stops. It's always there protecting us constantly. It doesn't even need to be turned on. You're born with it, right? It's innate to you, right? It doesn't need to be activated. It's always there. It's always protecting us. I feel like I could just gush a little bit about the innate immune system.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of parts of it, right? The skin, that's something that we take for granted, and
We do.
we don't always realize, like, this is going to sound really weird, but our skin is salty. I don't know if you just like had that, just you've been working out and you just get drenched in sweat. You're like,
Yup.
oh, I know this feeling, and it's a little salty, but that means that not all bacteria can grow on your skin. And so certain types of bacteria can, and they're almost helping us out because by taking up so much space, they prevent other bacteria that would harm us from living on our skin. And you can think about, okay, well, what happens when you get a cut, right? You have the possibility of getting an infection. And so that bacteria that's on your skin might start causing problems. But you don't get an infection every time you get a paper cut, right? Those things are annoying as can be and they hurt. But you don't typically get an infection. You wash your hands and you help get some of those bacteria off. But part of that is, like you were saying, the innate immune system. You don't need a bunch of B cells coming in and, flooding the area. There's a lot that's already there. Enzymes that start breaking things down and, some of the cells that get activated. And so the innate immune system is super helpful. If you think about it also, so I don't know if people realize this, but we are more bacteria than we are ourselves in terms of number of cells. It's a really weird thought.
It is a really weird thought.
Yeah. But like our GI system, our gastrointestinal system has a ton of bacteria, and we're not always with the runs, right? So we get a lot of help from the bacteria in our gut. There are connections with the bacteria in our gut being able to help us, even with things like blood clots and making sure we're not constantly bleeding. The bacteria in our gut can actually help us with like vitamin K, which is a pretty big component of it. And so it's just like a really rich topic. And have you ever tried, this is going to be a really weird question. Have you ever, like, either you or someone tried a probiotic? It's like,
yes. Yes. See, I thought you were going to talk about something that we had talked about a little bit before in relation to gut bacteria. I thought you were going to ask me about something very different.
No.
Okay, good.
Probiotics.
Probiotics, sure. Yeah. I've had physicians recommend them if you're taking antibiotics, because that bacteria is actually very important to have.
Exactly. And there's a lot of mixed data on probiotics. I'm just going to throw that out there. But it's like, that's why there's a whole industry on it, and it's a growing industry. And so these are the kinds of things that when you're a future physician, you need to know about, right? You're going to have patients come in and be like, hey, doc, like, should I take a probiotic? Does it make sense? Which ones should I take? And so thinking about those things now, you don't have to, like, that's not something you need to know for the MCAT. The MCAT's not going to test you on probiotics. But it's the kind of things that you can think about. Like, they could totally, if they really wanted to be weird, could throw a passage about.
That's what I was going to say. They could throw you something weird in like a question, an application kind of thing.
Exactly. but they're not going to expect you to like know the ins and outs of it as content that you're expected to know.
I feel like that's one of the funnest things about office hours is finding that difference of like, okay,
Yes,
this is still worth knowing. One, because it's awesome. And two, because you could see it on test day, but not in a discrete question like content that you're supposed to know. It's like they could ask you about it because it connects to something you should know.
Yeah.
And that's why it's fun to investigate the things you're curious about within fields relevant for medicine, because you never know how they're going to connect that, since today's all about connections, right? Connect it back to something that is MCAT relevant. No, I love that you bring that up because totally, I feel like that's so important for students to understand, and it makes things more fun because anything could be an MCAT passage.
Wait, so you mentioned office hours. Can you tell our listeners what office hours are?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. So office hours are live sessions that we hold for our course students, where you can submit questions, and instructors will grab your questions and essentially plan out how to really get you engaged and make concepts that you're struggling with click. Keep it fun, keep it light, use analogies and jokes and memory tricks, and basically, you know, all of our instructors are experts in their own right, experts in their own fields. But the challenge and the fun of office hours is like, how can we make this engaging and how can we make this stick, right? So that for all of our students that are coming to us with content areas or questions that they're really struggling with, we can really have a fun time with it, basically, and make sure that concept area doesn't trip you up again and again. And I will say that, in my times teaching biochem office hours, I've answered a ton of immune system questions. Yeah. Definitely something that a lot of students struggle with. So it's fun to be here talking about it.
Absolutely. And, it's also, I know in office hours and in the sciences, y'all also help students differentiate what is MCAT testable and content they need to know, and what is something that they can be curious about, but that they don't need to have the content down packed, right?
Yes.
And so some of the things that we're talking about, like we said, probiotics, not content you need to know. If you went into office hours asking the instructor, hey, probiotics, like what do they do? They might be like, oh, they introduce bacteria into your gut that is considered healthy, and that's it, right? Don't go deep diving into scientific literature. Don't hop onto PubMed looking for the most recent papers published about it. And so that guidance, I think, is really important, because the MCAT is, I like to say it's a mile wide and an inch deep, right? But it's about making the connections across those inches, across that mile. And so I think that's something that it's really easy to not always realize. And so that's part of why I like what we're doing here today on the podcast.
Yeah, me too. And I think it's always fun because, for me at least, when I'm trying to get a student to understand something that, one, I know they struggle with, and two, I know is complex, I always like to bring in weird little fun facts or stories or things like that that can help give you context and help get you interested, even if the content that you're trying to learn is scary, right? And that, I think, is that's the benefit of learning from people who actually love what they talk about, who love what they do. And yeah, I think it's so important to be looking for those connections, because not only does it make it more fun, but it also helps it stick to be finding those connections, which is so special. Especially when those connections represent a piece of your future, a piece of your dream, right? A piece of what you want out of your life. It makes it so much more special. So I love that not only do we have content to share today, but we also have medical applications of that, which is so much fun. I'm so glad that you're here to share that.
Speaking of connections, we can connect the innate immune system with the adaptive immune system. So you mentioned that the innate immune system doesn't have memory, meaning it will be there all the time to come at whatever is is first. It's first line of defense. And let's say something gets through the innate immune system, then the adaptive immune system steps in. And so I like to think of it primarily as B and T cells. And so B cells, they are the ones that will produce antibodies. And so antibodies will bind pathogens, will bind antigens, different kind of name for pathogens. And it's the pieces that get broken down and presented to cells that are going to be activated. And the T cells kind of come in two flavors. So there are the CD4 T cells. And so these are going to be the helper T cells. So what they're going to do is they're going to help the B cells get activated. And so you also have to know, so they're CD4 and they are MHC class 2. So I like to think of it as 2-4. They kind of go together, right? The CD8 cells, MH class 1, they are the ones that step in when your cells get infected. So if you get a virus, those are the ones that kind of step in to basically neutralize your cells. And so they're going to be active also in things like tumors and cancer. And so I like to remember that as, 2-4, I ate the problematic cell.
Oh, that's cute. I always just remember you multiply 2 by 4 and you get 8, or you multiply 8 by 1, you get 8.
That's another really easy way to remember it. So the CD4 cells, basically they help activate the B cells, and the B cells, they produce antibodies, but they have different types of antibodies, right? They have IgM. IgM is that first antibody that gets produced. And eventually, once this B cell gets activated, after a couple of days, it can start making IgG antibodies. And so these are the ones that are going to stick around. So these are going to be the ones that really help with memory. And so kind of a medicine connection is that when someone has an infection, how do you differentiate that they've had the infection before versus they're having an infection right now? And so we can do this by looking at the antibodies that are being produced. And so if you see IgG, it could be that they're a little later in the current infection, or they had one a long time ago. Whereas if you see IgM, you're like, this is a current problem that we need to tackle. And this means that the actual memory itself kind of lags behind, because we said it takes a couple of days to really start getting activated. But I know that there's a connection when, that we take advantage of. And I don't know if you want to share what that connection is that we take advantage of as physicians.
Which is, what are you leading me to, Azaii?
Vaccines.
Oh, well, okay. Yeah. It was like, you're going with memory. Yeah, of course, with vaccines, active and passive immunity. Yeah, we're teaching your body how to fight off an infection that you haven't had yet, which is amazing. Yeah, absolutely. So cool. Yeah, and that's why, that's why we are vaccinated against different diseases, right? It's basically training your body to respond to pathogens that it hasn't interacted with so that you don't get sick. You don't have to get sick in order to get that memory, right? And I think you touched on this, but right, when you're infected the first time, it takes a while to fight it off. The second time is so much faster because of the memory that the adaptive immune system has, right? You have cell types that are just waiting. I like to think of like a old man, like just sitting on his porch, like just like where, like, kids TP'd his house one time and now he's just like sitting there like, where are they? I will wait. I will sit on this porch and wait forever. No one will ever TP my house. That's what I think of when I think of memory cells.
That old man is
if they even spot something that looks like toilet paper, right? Best believe that old man's going to chase after you. That's a memory cell. So vaccines provide a way to create those old men sitting on porches that ultimately flow all throughout your blood, right? So that when or if you actually get the infection you are vaccinated against, you are able to fight it off.
Yeah, that old man is a G. You can just get it IgG.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Sorry, that was really
That was bad, but in the best way. That was fantastic.
I like little, cheesy jokes, some little puns. But on the topic of kind of differentiating what type of infection, if it's a current infection versus something you've been exposed to in the past, we can actually start thinking about and having clues as to what type of infection someone might have based off of which white blood cells we might see. And so what's really cool is that we have different types of white blood cells. And so you do have to know these very generally, broadly, what they do. You do not need to kind of go into the weeds about it. But when we think someone might have an infection, we look at how many white blood cells they have. So how many cells that fight off infections? Because if that's high, that person might have an infection. But if it's low, they may not have an infection. And so the other thing that we do is in medicine, when you order some labs for somebody, so this is beyond MCAT, what I'm going to share now. It's very much med school and your future career. But you get what's called a differential. And so it shows you the different cells and how many of them there are. So one of the ones that we look at is neutrophils. And so neutrophils are involved in primarily bacterial infections, but also fungal infections. So if you see that number high, you're thinking, oh, this person, I need to look for bacteria that might be causing problems, or I need to think about a fungus that might be causing some problems. And so this helps us think about that. We also have another cell type that's called mast cells. And so these are going to be the ones that are involved in allergies. They're also going to be involved in parasites and parasitic infections. So this is one of the ways that we can start differentiating, what type of infection someone might have. Now, this is not a perfect scenario, but it will help guide how you're thinking about what someone might have and what you're looking for.
Yeah. And I love that you're bringing up neutrophils and mast cells because I feel like another connection that we could be making, right, especially among the content that we've talked about already is, when we were discussing the innate immune system, we talked a lot about the barriers, the physical barriers, but there are cell types in there too that are protecting you, right? The mast cells, the neutrophils are macrophages, right? Our big eaters. They're all part of our innate immune system, right? These are cell types that are not specific to one individual piece of one molecule, like an antigen, right? It's not so hyper-specific. These are things that are going to roll around and swallow you up, digest you, and then display you to other cell types, either in MH1 or MHC class 1 or MHC class 2, depending on how it activates the adaptive, right? So all the things that we're talking about, right, they're all so interconnected, right? And ultimately, even just the connections between the innate and the adaptive are so important to understand. The fact that you have things like neutrophils, like macrophages that are communicating with the adaptive immune system, right? Things like dendritic cells as well, and even B cells, right? Communicating with other adaptive immune cells to turn them on and to activate them. So there's so much back and forth even between the cell types of different branches of the immune system, which is so, so special. And it's important to understand because, again, the AMC loves to test connections and the ways that, different body systems talk together, or even, like we said, different scopes of the immune system, different systems. Yeah. So there's so many different things that we could talk about here. And lots of different specific cell types that the MCAT will expect you to know. Know that Phil and Azaii did a whole podcast going in deep with this, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, it's from last July, Azaii?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Cool. So we've got additional content in there as well, since today we're more so focused on the connections.
I really like that you said the neutrophils roll around because they actually literally roll.
They actually literally roll.
Yes. And so it's just one of those things that's a weird, really cool fact. And so in med school, you're going to learn about the different proteins that help neutrophils roll. And so it's just interesting because that also helps us think about if someone has trouble fighting off infections, maybe that might be part of the problem. Maybe the function of the neutrophils is part of the problem. You mentioned the adaptive immune system, and there's a fact that I learned in med school that I absolutely love bringing up because it's so, I don't know, it's really interesting. So a lot of people get tattoos, right? And how do we get tattoos to stick in one place? Because there's something that's foreign. So you'd think, oh, our body would try and fight off tattoos because it's not part of us. And so what happens is that you have these cells that basically eat the ink from the tattoo. And these cells, they're resident. And so they stick where they are. And, you just have the pigment that's been swallowed and these cells that stick there. And so that's why your tattoos aren't going anywhere. But it's just one of those things that I find really cool, especially just because most people don't know this, but so many people get tattoos. And so your immune system is actually part of body art and representation of, ideas and what matters to people and just things that they found interesting. But it's a whole topic that I think is really cool.
Really cool fun fact. I love that. I really do. Yeah, the fact that, like you said, that your immune system is involved in having body art and keeping it around. Like you'd think that it would be part of destroying your tattoo, but it's actually part of keeping the ink in the same place, which is so fun. I feel like the connection to the immune system that always gets me like really, really intrigued is actually kind of what you were hitting on with like, this is foreign. Your body shouldn't just tolerate it. It shouldn't want to tolerate it. It shouldn't allow it to remain around, right? How your body tells what is foreign and what is not, and what goes wrong when your body gets it wrong, that I think it's so medically relevant, right? But it's also just fascinating because your whole immune system, its goal is to prevent foreign material from entering you. That's its first priority. And if it gets in, it wants to take care of it quickly, right? And just sweep it out with those innate immune cells that we're talking about. And if not, we've got to have a very specific catered attack because we do not want foreign material in our body. We have to protect ourselves. How the immune cells learn what is foreign and what is us is absolutely fascinating. And I always think about like the positive and negative selection, right? Of like, let's say T cells in the thymus, right? Where they have to decide, can I recognize what is me, right? Can I bind an MHC, right? As I was mentioning earlier, we have MHC class 1 and 2 that will tell you basically which type of T cell you're going to interact with, right? They have this system after these cells are created where they go to the thymus, which is an organ. It is how they created the name T cell, right? Where they'll go, these little baby immature T cells are just like, I'm just going to see if I can grab one of these MHC. I'm just going to give it my best shot, right? There's nothing in it. I'm just trying to see, it's almost like, can I just grab a door handle? Can I just touch it? If not, sorry, right? It gets outcompeted, right? Because it can't even recognize self, right? Positive selection, you want to recognize yourself. That's good, right? If you can recognize, you will survive. Negative selection is oof, right? You are binding yourself bound to yourself. Like you are not just binding MHC, but you are binding self antigens within those MHC. You are going to recognize your own tissues then as foreign, and you would have tried to attack it, right? Creating autoimmune disease, which you don't want, of course, right? This is part of the education of your adaptive immune cells. You're trying to teach them, hey, negative selection, you can't bind a self-antigen. That's actually going to cause apoptosis if your specific little claw, your little T cell receptor grabs onto it, right? That's now a bad thing because now you are training your T cells to recognize your own body as foreign. And that can create a whole host of downstream effects, right? A whole host of autoimmune disorders. So it's fascinating to me how your body educates itself to prevent its own attack, which is so cool.
Yeah, and there are doctors that focus on this. And I know a lot of times we go into medicine and medical school, and some people really know what they want to do. That can change. There are a lot of us that changed once we were in medical school. But there are doctors that, they are those specialists on this, and those are rheumatologists. And so, you can go into a lot of specialties, and we don't always know a lot of the ones that are out there. But I think it's worth kind of thinking about as your first year of med school and you start getting exposed to different specialties, just what's out there. And so hopefully if you're finding this interesting, that you're developing a curiosity, because that's what we enjoy as instructors at Jack Westin. And I know a lot of us have the goal of helping you succeed on the MCAT, but also considering that transition to medical school and how can we make it a little easier. And so I know in the past, Phil and I have, we talked about kind of studying and ways to study effectively. And so part of that is, part of that are things that you can translate to your future career. But what's really cool is that just because we see that someone has a lot of these cells doesn't always mean infection. And so that's something else that is primarily something that is you'll focus on your future career, less so on the MCAT, but it's a really interesting topic.
Yeah. So there are many different reasons why you could have an elevated white blood cell count. And I remember that you were just telling me about several of them, which is so fun, right? Reasons why you may have elevated white blood cell count in things like a pulmonary embolus, right? If you have a pulmonary embolism, that can increase your white blood cell count, or even exposure to steroids, right? These are things that can change your body chemistry, and your body will react in a way that mimics infection without you actually being sick, right? So it's so fascinating in medicine how many different layers there are to consider, right? How many different factors could be influencing the one symptom that you are observing, right? And it really brings up how important these connections are, because you have to know all the different factors that can influence something like white blood cell count in order to properly understand what a lab result will mean, and especially how to address the finding that you just made, right? Mm-hmm. These things, as you're primed to look for these connections, right? It helps lead you to how you need to treat this patient to specifically take care of whatever issue you've uncovered, which is really special as well.
Yeah. And just for anyone who's not familiar, pulmonary embolism is basically a clot in your lungs. And so you can think about it, that would disrupt the blood flow in your lungs, and that would be really problematic. Your body would get stressed and it will, activate. And so that's why you might have that kind of elevated white blood cell count. So what happens when the immune system isn't working properly? You can be born with problems with your immune system, with the B cells, with the T cells. And so based off of the infections that a kid or, an adolescent is having, you can actually figure out what type of infection they have. So pop quiz, if someone has problems with B cells, just for our listeners, pause and think about what types of infections you might have. So pause the video or the podcast and give it 5 seconds and think about what types of infections. All right. So welcome back. So if you have problems with B cells, we talked about how B cells can be involved in a lot of bacterial infections, right? What about T cells? Pause the video and pause the podcast. All right, so welcome back again. So if you have problems with T cells, you might, depending which T cells, you might have problems with those bacterial infections, right? Which ones are the ones that are helper T cells, activate the B cells. And you can also have problems with viruses. If it's the ones that, if you have problems with the CD8 or MHC class, MHC class 1, those are the ones that are going to help protect against viruses. So these are the kinds of things that you can kind of briefly quiz yourself on to help you remember the difference between them. And I know I shared with you before we started a really dorky video. So a lot of times people don't know what the spleen does. And so the spleen is actually involved in your immune system. Yeah, and so if you feel like looking it up, feel free to do so. But there's a video that an older Harvard medical class made. Y'all, it's so bad, but that's what makes it good.
It's spectacular it's terrible in the most spectacular way.
Yeah, feel free to look it up. I think it was the class of 2016, but it's actually titled "What Does the Spleen Do?" But it's really dorky, but that's personally why I love it.
Yeah, I loved it too. As I sent it to me just before we started podcasting, and I like almost cried. If you haven't seen it yet, definitely go check it out. Oh my goodness, all those costumes. Throw it way back to the "What Does the Fox Say" video. That's what it's the parody of. Oh my goodness, I never thought I would hear that song again. And there it was. I love those sorts of little dorky videos and songs because you'll never forget what the spleen does when they eventually figure it out in the video. You will never ever forget. Yeah, but oh, go ahead, Azaii.
There was a video that I wish I remembered. For the Krebs cycle, and it was based off of a song. I don't know if you ever saw it. I used that when I was trying to study for the MCAT because you do need to know the metabolic pathways for the MCAT. And those can be pretty tough because you just have to memorize them. But if you can start making those connections, it makes it a little easier to memorize. Maybe I think it might have been either Uptown Funk or one of the older one of the older songs. I wish I could remember what it was. If I had remembered this before we, kind of started chatting, I definitely would have looked it up. But
I'm so curious.
I'll have to get back to you on that one. But it was a really good video. So we talked about, you already talked about the kind of treatment aspect of it. And I know you gave me basically a little tidbit of a way that you like to remember how the different cells, and I won't kind of spoil it, but just how you can figure out one type of bacteria from another that we do need to know for the MCAT.
Yeah. I love that earlier you were talking about how, understanding the lab results that you have can help you design the treatment or help you understand really what is going on in that individual's body, right? And if it's a bacterial disease, right? If we know, okay, we've got a bacterial infection, taking a culture and really looking closely at those bacteria, you can actually see structural differences in the types of bacteria that this individual may be sick with that totally change the way that you would want to respond to it. So the two different classes that we have of these bacteria, and this is MCAT relevant. You do need to know this. It's gram-positive bacteria and gram-negative bacteria. And these are named based on gram staining, whether or not they turn purple in, I think it's crystal violet. There's reagents that you'll add for gram staining that will turn you purple if you've got an outside of your cell membrane that's coated with a particular protein called peptidoglycan. Now this, if you have it on the outside of your plasma membrane, keep in mind all living cells, right, have a plasma membrane. Some bacteria, or I guess all bacteria, have peptidoglycan cell wall on the outside. But some bacteria, those pesky gram negatives, they have a layer of that protein, and then they have another plasma membrane. So they hide that. I like to think of it as hair. They hide their hair real well, such that really it just looks like a naked plasma membrane on the outside. Or maybe it's got its like maybe glycoproteins on it, for example, but there isn't that peptidoglycan. If you have a gram-positive bacterium, you can really easily attack that with antibiotics because, fun fact, peptidoglycan is exclusive to bacteria. If you see peptidoglycan in your body, it's a bacterium. Like, we don't express it as human beings. None of our cells do. So if it's there, you've got an infection. Like, you've got at least bacteria loose in your bloodstream, presumably. So it's a great way, if you know it's gram-positive, there are ways that you can attack it based on its extracellular, I guess, coatings, right? It's cell wall that you can't with gram-negative, right? And the two of them have different, they create different kinds of disease, right? And they're treated differently. So it's very important to understand the type of infection that you have, because the type of treatment that you design for that infection has to match. Also with antibiotic resistance, you got to make sure that your bacteria are susceptible to the type of antibiotic that you want to treat your patient with. Because if not, you're pumping them full of antibiotics that's killing off all of their commensal bacteria, that, as I was telling us about earlier, which can be dangerous. That's why there's that huge market for probiotics.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to think that a lot of the topics on the MCAT help us at, the beginning of medical school with our careers. And so sometimes I remember I definitely thought of this. There were times where I thought, the MCAT, I'm never going to use this in medical school. So why am I learning this? But there are a lot more connections than we might realize when we're studying. And so that's something that I like to tell students. And I primarily do cars. But I like to tell students that even in that section, there's no content that you need to have memorized, but the way you think affects, when you're doing cars, the way that you're thinking and analyzing can actually influence how you analyze on the other sections, but just in your career in general. And so each of the sections on the MCAT has a role. And so I like to try and help students realize that it is important. And so I know we did a podcast episode on cars. And so we talked about how a lot of that is the shift in mindset, and that can make cars more engaging, a little bit easier. But I know this is a science podcast episode, but I just wanted to make a quick plug.
But it's important. It is important. And I feel like the connections that you make with whatever experience you're having in your life, whether it's you closing the book or closing that chapter of your life with the MCAT and starting the new one with admissions, or whether it's, oh shoot, I'm in my test day experience. I just finished Chem Phys, I'm coming into cars, or whether it's something symbolic in your life, the spin and the connections that you make with the things that happen around you can totally impact the meaning that you get from those experiences, right? And that's true of content as well. You control the spin that you put on things. And if you learn things and your spin is, I'm never going to use this again, guess what? You're never going to remember it because you've assigned no meaning to this. You basically said, this is useless information. I'm going to keep it for a second, then I'm going to toss it out. It's like your brain just labeled that as unimportant. Why would it keep it around? If you assign importance, if you make connections to things that you care about, or if you connect it to your life, or if you, research into clinical applications, or you find some odd way to connect it to your favorite animal or whatever, you assign meaning to it and it becomes a higher priority piece of information in your brain. You're more likely to remember it because it has significance to you. We don't always have we don't always get to choose like, oh, you know what? Today I'm going to wake up. I want to study Newtonian physics. You might have to do it. You might not want to. But when you look to make those connections and assign that meeting, that's when not only is it going to be fun, but it's going to be easier to remember. You're not going to have to study it so long anyways. It's kind of backwards. It's almost like reverse psychology for your brain. But, I'm glad that you brought that up, even if, CARS is an offshoot from what we're talking about today, because it's not in the context of connections. It's really, really valuable to understand that. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Suspect this is also, you've definitely had this question. Students ask this question, how can I remember things? And so I think what you're describing is something that is important and answers that question. And I know when we got questions into, to the podcast email, if just another quick plug, it's podcast@jackwestin.com. Feel free to email questions. I know one student asked about metabolic pathways, and that's something that we're hoping to eventually cover. It's a little tougher to cover on the podcast without visuals, so that's something that we're thinking about. We did not miss this question. We are not ignoring this question, but it's important to think about. So I know we've been talking for a bit. I just want to leave y'all on something that I think is really important, and it's a way that you might save future lives. And that's thinking beyond what you expect to see, thinking beyond what's common. And so one of the things that is important, we talked about a lot about bacterial infections. You can have what are called atypical bacterial infections. And we don't always look for those because we think common things being common, it'll most likely be one of the common ones. But a lot of the antibiotics don't cover those atypical bacteria. And so you might save someone's life by thinking, what else could it be? Or we don't always test for fungal infections right away. And so thinking, could this be a fungal infection? Again, might save someone's life. So having this curiosity as you're learning these topics isn't just for you. It's the possibility of helping a family keep someone that matters to them around. And so y'all have the power to change lives even before you get to medical school, even before you graduate as a doctor, by having this curiosity, by thinking beyond what is common. And so I think that's something that is important for us to share. And I know we care about our students, and we also care about their future careers. And so that's something that we wanted to leave y'all on, because I think it helps put things into perspective, recognizing that learning and remembering is life-changing, even if it doesn't always feel like it when we're studying for something like the MCAT, which can be super stressful.
Could not have said it better myself. That was beautiful. Thank you, Azaii.
Thank you to our listeners as well. Thank you to all of the students that support us. And I know that's core students, not core students. If you're interested in checking out what our fantastic instructors can do, you can attend free trial sessions that we have to help students figure out, would we be a good fit for y'all? And if you're interested in meeting some of our instructors in office hours, like you were talking about, Molly, head over, and our academic advisors, who it's free to meet with, can help get you connected.
Yeah, they're amazing. You guys are not going to regret meeting with them and just chatting. They're so wonderful, and they can really help you figure out, how to get to where Azaii is today, right? How best can we support you so that you have the opportunity to take what you've learned here in this podcast, connecting things that you're learning now with clinical applications. How can we get you to a place where you're learning or you're using that knowledge and applying it in your career? That's all we want for you. Thanks for listening, guys.